Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's session. I am thrilled to be here today. We're going to have a wonderful conversation today with a very special guest. Thank you for joining us. I'm James Barnard, Associate Vice President at BWF. We're a national full-service fundraising consulting firm. I lead our annual giving and digital marketing services. And the thing I love most about this work is that I get to meet tons and tons of really great, interesting, innovative people from everyone at the team at BWF, which I always describe as a bunch of really smart people just geeking out over fundraising, to interacting with all of our clients every day. Some of the smartest people I meet are our clients, and I learn from them all the time. And then every so often, I get to have conversations with people like today's guests who are true thought leaders, people who, I look forward to chatting with, and I have been excited about this conversation. Today's guest, she's the host of the Development Debrief stories-based podcast. In her spare time, shall we say, she's also a director of major gifts and strategic engagement at the Chapin School in New York. And prior to that, she was a major gift officer at Columbia University. Please welcome Kathryn Van Sickle. Kathryn, how are you today?
Thank you, James. I'm so excited. This is so much fun, frankly, to just talk about the inspiring work of the 8+. I say 8+ because we had, I think, 3 guests on our last episode, but people who were on this series. And so I'm just really excited to dig in.
Yeah, it's going to be a great conversation. And we're here today to really debrief the Development Debrief. So we're going to be kind of reviewing the season episode by episode, discussing some key takeaways, specifically about the theme of the season, which was innovation and impact. Before we get to that, we want this to be interactive. So please send us your questions. There's a Q&A function. If you're tuned in on Zoom, if you're on Facebook Live, you can put those in the comments. By all means, put it in the chat. And naturally, let's go ahead and get started with the chat. Please let us know where you're tuning in from today. And we'd love to hear from you. Have you been a long-time listener of the podcast? Have you never heard it before? A new listener? Really would love to hear about your experiences and what you like about the podcast. So please chime in on the chat. Thanks for being here. Like I said, we're going to attempt to cover some key takeaways, and there's a lot to get through. We only have an hour, so we're going to do as much as we can of that. But before we get into the episode by episode breakdown, I want to pull a line from one of your guests this season, Kathryn, Jason Briggs. He was talking about an episode where, he had a fear of sort of sharing ideas, and he actually had a phobia of public speaking. And he had a whole story about the first time he was booked to speak publicly, and he had to fake an emergency and pretend to run to the train station. Fascinating story. And many of us, I think, can relate to that. And it's something that he actually overcame in very dramatic style and sort of built a whole career out of these kind of engagements. But the thing he was talking about was people who have an idea and they're thinking about maybe starting a blog or creating a platform to share their ideas. And I couldn't help but, when I was listening to this, just feel great admiration for you, Kathryn, because over the last 2 years, you've really done that. You have gone out and started this podcast. It's something that a lot of people have thought about doing. A lot of people talk about creating their own podcast. Close friends of mine know it's something I talk about all the time. I've never gone out and done it. You have. So congratulations to you. You're about 2 years in, 6 seasons. What led you to create a podcast? How did the Development Debrief come about?
Thank you so much. And I have to let you all know, I do work in a school. I am in a school. So I don't know if you can hear the background noise, but I can hear, I think it's lower school students, young girls going up the staircase. So I'm sorry if that gets in the way, but hey, we're in the field, literally. Thank you, James, for your kind words. And I have to say it was a, combination of things that brought this together. It was a genuine passion for the work. It was great appreciation for the people in my network that I met. I had the privilege of meeting trustees at my own college when I was a student, and I built those relationships. And then through that, Rhea Turtletaub, who was one of my early guests, she's the vice chancellor at UCLA. She was an early mentor, and she introduced me to other people. So I just And then, my dad is in the field and I knew a lot of people through him. So I wanted to share all of this knowledge that I felt like I had been privileged to get from a very young age since I was in college. So there was that piece. And then I did my master's in strategic communications. And it was really when I was graduating in it was December of 19 that I realized I've learned a lot of these skills. I don't want to go into communications, but I want to keep the muscles going in terms of sharing ideas, having really sticky ideas to get out to people. And so I thought, let me put what I learned into practice in my own field and try this. And I still remember telling my friends, if 40 people listen to each episode, that would be so amazing. And now, we're close to 1,000 per episode. And I never could have imagined that. So that's the main answer, but a variety of reasons that came together at the right time.
I mean, you recently surpassed 50,000 downloads.
Yeah.
So I don't know if, 40 per episode. I don't know if that was ever in your sort of your imagination of where this was going to go, but it's been very successful.
Yeah, that was a number that I definitely could not have imagined. And I think it really speaks to how many people care about this work. And I think that the reason why the number is so high is because we have a real diversity of thought on this podcast. And that's been one of the visions or the priorities for me from the beginning, was diversity in all of its forms: geographic, age, seniority, consultant versus in the field, donor, racial and gender diversity, all of those things. And I think that's part of why people are loving it, because they're hearing from people that look and sound like them and people that don't look and sound like them. And that's, to me, very important.
Absolutely. And actually, diversity of thought is a great sort of segue, I think, into the theme of this season, the 6th season. I love your mug. That's great. So the theme was innovation and impact. I know this is something that BWF was really enthusiastic about sponsoring for this year. Innovation is really one of our core tenets. I don't almost say that we're sort of obsessed with innovation, because we truly believe like you have to keep changing things in order to be continually successful. Why was the innovation and impact theme important to you?
Well, I think conceptually, the idea of innovation is so exciting. I started a podcast. So, initially I was a little bit nervous to say this to myself, but I think now that I'm 2 years in, I can say I'm an entrepreneur. And a huge part of being an entrepreneur is being innovative and looking beyond the hedges, as they say. And so that spoke to me, both the inspiration from my guests, but then the other thing that I really didn't talk about in these episodes is that I have been able to do some innovative work myself. In my, what did you call it? Not my day job. You called it the other things time. I do.
Your hobby.
So very early on in my career, and I have to shout out Abigail Smitka, who's on the call from Harvard, based in Cambridge. I did a project for my alma mater. The title was Alumni Engagement Consultant. And what I did as a 20-something was I reached out to alums to truly learn what they were passionate about with the school, didn't ask them for money, and got them reconnected. And there are people from that group that are now on the board track at Trinity. And that it wasn't very long, because I eventually then was hired into the annual fund, but that was an incredible way to start, from day one, piloting something. And then I moved on to Columbia, and I have to shout out Jane Lowry, who's on the call, who works at Stanford. She's on the West Coast. She was a colleague of mine in this, where I was part of developing a new team at Columbia. We created a central major gifts team. And so I have done the work myself, and it's so much fun and I love it. So there were many levels where it connected with me.
Yeah. Do you think innovation is something that comes naturally to this field, this line of work?
I think that it can if we're willing to. There's so many new ways that we can look at things, and we have to adapt with the technology and the changing world of business and philanthropy, et cetera. But there has to be a willingness to do so, because I think sometimes human nature is, we've always done it this way, or I already did it this way and I know that it works, so I don't want to try something else. So I think of innovation as almost like trying to stay in shape. You just have to keep doing it, because it can be very scary if you haven't done it in a while, or you're set in a comfortable zone.
Yeah. I think we through this season of the Development Debrief really heard many examples of what innovation can look like, and also different and the many emerging themes. I think give experiences from BWF of why innovation is important to us. Our CEO, Josh Burkholz, was kind of one of the initial thought leaders in fundraising analytics. He wrote the book on that. One of our previous principals was a founding member of APRA and wrote books about prospect research. Our team was embedded in the first ever Giving Day at Florida State. And many more examples of things like this are where it's important. So one of the things that is great about BWF is we often would have people who come to us who are have the beginnings of these ideas, and we get the opportunity to kind of help them put those into action. So, to answer my own question, does it come naturally? Does innovation come naturally? I think so. I think we're in a space that it's not necessarily easy to innovate all the time. It depends very much on the organization, the institution you're with. But there's a lot of people out there who are very entrepreneurial, who very much want to change the way things work. A lot of us get into this line of work because we want to make a meaningful difference in the lives of other people. And so one of the ways to do that is to start kind of disrupting your organization and finding ways to do things better. So let's start talking through this season. I'd love to hear from you first, some of your kind of overarching takeaways. What are the big things that emerged through this sort of topic of innovation and impact throughout the episodes?
So, it was great to record with everyone. And I do think that we heard overall themes, but I did some reflection after it was all said and done. And I think there really are 4 pillars that stood out to me from our guests that they all had in common. And by the way, we haven't said this, but I believe we have 2 of our guests on the call, which I'm so delighted by. And if they are on, they may be able to answer questions through the chat. We'll see. But thank you, Rob and Letty, for joining. The first pillar we've already touched on, it's diversification. Oh, there's Rob. And diversification, again, my favorite term here is in all of its forms. So really, I remember, Karl Klaus at Colgate saying that there was a group of people at the university that they didn't ask about a project, and they came to realize that actually that group had a great idea, this unexpected viewpoint that was really important. So really bringing people together with differing viewpoints to find new solutions. The second pillar is collaboration. I think it's impossible to innovate without collaboration. And that's something that I learned in my own work, and we heard again and again on the season, building trust with colleagues, whether it is peers in the development space, or it's your CFO or your, dean of admissions, or, whoever you really are dependent on to have their buy-in, their trust. That is so critically important. The third thing is support from leadership. We heard this, a lot from Matt Hutter, that his work was a presidential priority. You don't have to be in the weeds with leadership, but they have to have some kind of invested interest in the project that you're working on for you to really have real success and impact. And then lastly, my favorite one, bravery and boldness. is not easy work. And so putting yourself out there, and I think part of that is communicating early wins. That's something that a lot of us aren't comfortable with, kind of sharing our successes. It has to happen to get the word out about the important work that's being done. So that was another reason why I was so excited to record, for people to hear the great work that's being done. As fundraisers, we're used to being in the background, and this conversation can bring us to the forefront to really celebrate. So those were the pillars that I saw, and I think we'll continue to touch on those as we talk about the episodes.
Yeah, I love bravery and boldness. That's a fantastic fourth pillar. And, we also heard, I believe it was Sue Cunningham, the president of CASE, in her episodes talked about the space to fail, or the freedom to fail. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but that's a critical piece of this. And I think I would add that, you have these four pillars, and then you have to build this on a foundation of intentionality. I think for the most part, innovation is not just going to happen by accident. That doesn't mean it won't. But if you want it to happen, you have to put these things in place intentionally. Certainly, we definitely heard this from your guests, thinking about diversification, perhaps. It doesn't just happen. It has to be an intentional plan around doing that, to surround yourself by a diverse group of people, which is a great segue to talking about your guests from the New School, Jonah Nye, Margaret Kaufman, Alex Tapnio. What did you learn from Jonah, Margaret, and Alex about innovation?
I have to say, I don't want to admit bias, but this was my favorite episode. And so I did save it for last because I just thought it was so important and so exciting. I learned so much from them. I think you're right that the biggest takeaway was an intentionality. And I just keep hearing Meg's head in the back of my mind, because we actually have an opening right now that I'm hiring for. Our plan is to get it posted by the end of the week on our team. And she just keeps saying, I just keep hearing her say, wanting to do better is not enough. Saying that you're committed to doing better is not enough. You have to take the action. And I think, another thing I learned, I was a little bit nervous to record the conversation as a white host, bringing up conversation about their experiences and as BIPOC colleagues and BIPOC professionals. And I took that bravery to put my own feelings aside and put them front and center. And I just learned so much about how hard it is. I mean, it takes, what they were talking about, building hiring committees. And I don't know if people on the call do this in their work, but this is something that Chapin does. We have to have a committee of 5 to 6 people from the school, a couple from your department, but then a couple not in your department. And there needs to be several forms of diversity. So I've just formed my committee. It's 6 people, including me. And that adds time. It adds time and it's more work, but I think it's worth it because it will help you get the right person. So I was excited to hear that they also use that committee model. And if people have questions about that, I'm happy to talk about it either here or offline. But I do think that's one very important way to rethink the hiring process.
Absolutely. Yeah, keep your questions coming in the chat or the Q&A. We'll try to answer some of those as we go. Something I heard in that episode was that innovation doesn't always have to be huge. Sometimes it can be small. And I find that to be such an encouraging idea, that it doesn't always have to be this enormous thing that you're tackling a giant problem, and that actually you can kind of make these smaller impacts and they're still very meaningful. At the same time, some of the examples that they were giving about their hiring practices and how they've assembled, the most what they believe is one of the most diverse presidential cabinets in the sector.
Yes.
That doesn't sound so small, and certainly not in the impact they make. Right. I think it's not an easy thing to do, and kudos for figuring it out and doing it really well, and especially for sharing the story so that others can learn from them.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up because I think both things are true. I think that small actions can lead to huge change. Again, I'll use the working out metaphor of, running is really daunting. Running a marathon is extremely daunting, but if you break it down to 1 mile at a time and you keep at it every day, you are going to get to that distance. And that's sort of how I think about this work. They talked about checking in with your colleagues to see how they're doing and what they're experiencing. That is a very small sort of, action that you're putting forward to create that space for your report, or even as you're managing up to your boss, but that's going to have massive impact on that person's experience, to feel supported, to know that they can leave a conversation if it's not appropriate, or whatever it may be. I also think bringing people into the room, bringing people, this has been said many times, bringing people to the table in new ways is a small action that can really have a huge impact. And I think too, we've heard this a lot over the last several months, over the last several years, but it's also not enough to just hire BIPOC employees. You have to provide the support and the resources along the way. And so I see that again as small action. But, I think of another episode that I had, this was over a year ago. I remember one of my guests talked about carving out 20 minutes every morning to be in touch with donors. That's a very small thing that is going to add up if you commit to doing that every day, 20 minutes a day. That will yield deeper relationships. And so that's the way I think about that. Yeah, the 20-minute rule. Like, what can you do 20 minutes a day that will contribute to your greater goal?
Yeah. And I heard a different spin on this actually in a client conversation recently of someone in the vice president role, so that sort of chief fundraising officer role, carving out 15 minutes to meet with many, many different employees.
Yes.
So 15 minute individual. And I think this is another key piece, this idea of amplifying voices. Mm-hmm. And, I think that's pretty critical to innovation as well. And so people in the chief executive role, certainly meeting with donors is very important, but also the team, especially larger organizations, that's a critical piece.
And, this idea of an open door policy, it's huge. And some leaders say that they have it and some don't, but maybe they would be willing to take a meeting with anyone in the organization. But I remember having this conversation with my dad on an earlier episode. And he said, I say that my door is open and I'll meet with anyone, but a lot of people don't ask for the time. So that's something where, do you have something that you want to talk about? Do you have a big idea? Well, the brave and bold thing to do is to set up a meeting and communicate that idea to the leadership. And you might be surprised by how much openness there is to hear that and think about it.
Yeah. And, just going back to the intentionality piece, it's a great idea to say my door is always open. It's another to mean it. And, I wonder if one way to show that you mean that is for you as the leader to go about setting those appointments instead of waiting for people to have the courage to do it.
Yeah.
Some of those ideas aren't going to come from people who just, don't care how this goes. I'm just going to walk into the CEO or the VP's office and tell them my idea. But you get them alone for 15 minutes, and that's so easy with Zoom. Get them alone for 15 minutes and they may actually start to talk.
I'm sure Josh has an open door policy.
He does. He certainly does. And, that's one of the best things about working with Josh is I think it may be his favorite thing to do is just to talk about ideas. So that creates a really kind of innovative environment for sure.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about your season opener with Sue Cunningham, the president of CASE, somebody I absolutely admire and have looked up to. CASE has certainly been very important in my own career. I'd love to hear from you how you've been involved in CASE and what kind of impact that's made on your career.
So I had the iconic experience of going to Tuck at Dartmouth for the, for, I think it's called like the first time fundraisers, or, early in your career fundraisers. I believe I did that in 2014. And I still remember a lot of the people who were there, a lot of the presenters, one of whom was Fritz Schrader, who's the VP at Hopkins. There's an episode featuring him again, maybe over a year ago. He was an early guest, and there are still people that I met that I'm in touch with from that experience. So that, for anyone on here who hasn't done that, even if you're a couple years in, I highly, highly recommend doing it, because it's just incredibly formative. Even if you feel like you're not new anymore, the networking that you will experience, and just going to Hanover, New Hampshire, it's so beautiful, is really worth it. And, over the years, it's been great to, tap into different webinars and things. And I'm working with them now. I've already recorded the whole mini series of an independent school mini series of conversations with leaders in the independent school world. And that's going to be coming out in May. I'm really excited because I think there is a sense of, higher ed, universities, hospitals, these big organizations that are very complex, that their work is more sophisticated than that of independent schools, where maybe the team is anywhere between 2 and 10 people. But this miniseries really debunks that actually the work that we're doing now is, just as good as the rest of them, and people are doing really exciting work. So I think CASE has been a great partner, and I'm excited to keep working with them.
Yeah, I think something CASE has done really well is making sure that we bring along lots of different kind of organizations that don't all look the same. And it's not all about the big schools with the big budgets, but making space for independent schools, for example, and others that, are smaller and have less resources, but nevertheless need to be part of that conversation. Do you think organizations like CASE play an important role in innovation in the field?
Definitely. Because I think so much of doing new things is about hearing, back to the amplification, it's about hearing what other people are doing and realizing if they can do that, then I can do it too, whether it's the same thing or your other idea that you weren't sure if you should try. We have to support each other. And I think what CASE does really well is it sets up a platform for people to volunteer and support one another. And so CASE talks about it being a professional home. I think that if you take that seriously, you will find support, ideas, networking, and you're only going to get better from that, from hearing other views and other opinions. And the other thing I want to say about CASE too, that I didn't fully appreciate, was that they are incredibly international. Mm-hmm. And that's huge. I mean, they are thinking globally, and I think we should be doing more of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think one of my things that I heard and wrote down was Sue saying, having the space to fail is critically important. Is that something you think that we have enough of? There's, as fundraisers, there's always pressure. And I wonder if people sometimes feel I'm encouraged to try new things as long as I also meet my goals for the year. It's okay to fail as long as you still do this. Do you think that's, anecdotally, do you feel like that's possibly true?
Oh my gosh, it's such a long held tension, I think, in the industry, that we need to have a long game and we want the money in the door yesterday. And how do we straddle that tension and that need? Because a lot of these ideas do take time. The new team that I was part of at Columbia, it took several years to get to a point where I was raising the money that I wanted to be raising, portfolio building. And I'm talking about major gifts, but so there's more wiggle room, I think, in that world. But, annual giving and other areas too, that we need to try new things. Giving days, we're a huge innovation. And now almost everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people are doing it. And it's been a game changer for a lot of institutions. But I had another thought on this. Oh, yes. So I think it's important to have a proven track record if you're going to be put out on the line to try something new, so that you know that people are trusting you, that if maybe it didn't happen in the timeline that was suggested, that it will still happen. And I was thinking about Matt Hutter, because he was actually hired to do this work. And so he didn't have the track record at Duke, but then the more I think about it, he had the track record at Oregon where he was before, and he had proven results. So that's where it goes back to kind of celebrating early wins. I think you need to be an advocate for yourself to create space to fail.
Yeah.
Otherwise there's,
But, I wonder if that's almost a fifth pillar, or if it's a roof on top. Trust. It's such an important piece in creating that space to fail, but also, and when we talk about space, not just meaning, it's okay to fail, you'll be forgiven, but here are your goals for the year, but giving that runway, which it sounds like at Columbia, when you were creating that team, you had some runway, you had a sort of a timeline to create a program and to build something that was designed for the long term, and not about, let's do as much as we can in the next 6 months.
Right. Well, and Letty mentioned something similar when I said, I kept asking her, well, what do you bring in each year and what's the average? And she's like, I can't answer that. With this work, one year you could be raising $30 million, and the next year it could be 5, and the next year it could be 60. It's a human enterprise, as we've heard many times. It's a human enterprise. So it's not black and white, but you have to have that behind you, that trust.
Well, let's talk about Letty. Letty lads at UC Berkeley, one of the most complex, interesting, and certainly one of the most successful higher education fundraising organizations there is.
And she is on, by the way. Hi, Letty.
Hi, Letty. Thanks for joining us. I've done some work with Berkeley. They're one of our clients, and have gotten to know the vast complexity of that organization. But listening to Letty's episode really was it took it to a new level for me. And, I think it's rare, actually. Obviously, it's different in the world of principal gifts, but to have such fluctuation in your annual goals, most fundraisers, I think, will probably tell you, whatever I raise this year, my goal next year is that plus a little bit. They don't normally get this. Well, okay, this year, you're working on a much longer timeline. So the goal has some more variability in it. So that I think in itself is one thing. I did enjoy Letty described innovation as collaborative, big dreaming. Do you think she's right about the collaborative part? Could you innovate on your own? Absolutely, she's right. There's just no way to do this without collaboration from colleagues. And, it's funny. I was at a liberal arts college, then I went to a university, and now I'm at a tiny independent school. And I think people think that those are different. At least I know I did before I had the 3 experiences, that, the collaboration looks so different if you have a tiny team or a team of hundreds. It's not. You need buy-in from your peers and your superiors and people who are reporting up to you to accomplish these big things. And I loved how Letty demystified the fact that principal gifts are huge teams. There may be one officer, but it's huge teams of people across the university. And in her case, even with other universities where they had that dual report. I don't know if you remember that. They talked about that. I mean, that it was so cool. That was dreaming, I would say. I mean, I wouldn't have even thought of that. And a question I have, I don't know, if anyone would have the answer for this, is how size and complexity affects our ability to innovate. And I suppose this can go in both ways. Gives you more people to bring into the conversation, more perspectives, and we've already sort of outlined that as a good thing. But size and complexity also creates barriers and red tape and things that get in the way of innovating. And certainly we often see some really great examples of innovation at places with a very small team, far fewer resources, and sometimes where people kind of have their backs against the wall and are forced to think differently about things because there is no comfort in the status quo. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but how that sort of complexity and size of organization can really help or hinder the innovation process.
So I think that if anyone has thoughts on this, please enter into the chat, but I'll share my own experience. I think, so for example, at a place like Chapin, I'm the director of major gifts and I'm essentially the major gifts department, right? So, it's, whereas say at Yale, there's 50 people or more in maybe 75 people in major gifts at Yale, but there's still the same barriers. It's just one person versus many. It's a volume thing. Letty wrote in, I agree that it's both and yeah. So you still have to get the buy-in, right? Mm-hmm. So here that they might just need my buy-in, but if they don't have my buy-in, it's not going to be as successful. I think so. It's really about buy-in. Like, I know that sounds simple, but, and that was the same thing I experienced at Columbia. Like, if people don't trust you, and if they don't want to work with you, it doesn't matter how good your idea is. You're not going to raise the money. You're not going to get the shared credit. You're not going to get the doors opened. And I think, Rob Scott could probably weigh in on this as well, that as great as the idea was, if the president wasn't signing off on the travel or the people, Rob talked about stepping aside and letting other gift officers go to those meetings. That's collaborative. That's complexity. That's emotional intelligence that we aren't necessarily taught, but that he knew that was true. And I really wanted to highlight that because that was so huge at Columbia, to take your ego out of it and figure out what needs to be put in place to move forward. And it may or may not be with you.
Yeah. I love that idea that sometimes collaboration might be a handoff process. It's a little different way of thinking about it. Please keep your ideas coming in the chat about
thank you, Letty.
How you feel these, the size of the organization affects things. I also want to point out one other thing that Letty mentioned in her episode that I just thought was so important. It was I felt one of the most important things in the whole season. And that's, in order to innovate, you do need to understand the context and the history. And I think there's a tendency sometimes to come in with new ideas and just to say, we're going to change everything. We're going to disrupt. This is what we're going to do. And failure to understand where an organization has been in the past, and it may not be that long ago. We may not be talking about 100 years. You may be talking about, the last couple of years. Maybe that idea was tried, and that I think also points to not bringing in diversity of perspective and diversity of thought to the table, because you might just be missing those key perspectives.
Yes, I think there's a certain hubris that people need to be careful of and aware of, that even if it really is a brilliant idea, I think about like real estate developers, right? They have the best materials and they have a brilliant, setup of a new neighborhood, but if it ticks people off and it's not wanted, people aren't going to buy the houses. You have to have the context. I was so glad that Letty said that. It's so true. It may have been tried before and didn't work. A big part of that is having respect for the institution and the history, respect for the history, respect for the people who have been there before you, because institutional knowledge is completely invaluable. And that's why it's important that people don't move around as much as they are in our industry, because otherwise you're just not going to know. And then you are shooting in the dark.
Yeah. Yeah. So in contrast to Letty, you talked to Karl Klaus at Colgate. He's working in a far smaller campus, presumably a less complex environment. What do you think about his experiences and his perspectives and how those compare to Letty's?
Yeah, so this is such a great question. Karl, first of all, he's an alum. So he's worked there before. So he has, at least 2 different decades of flavors of the university and where it's been. And he has that personal experience, which I think just positions him so well. It's not to say that you have to be an alum to lead an institution, but I think that certainly was a very attractive part of his, what he brought to this third century campaign. But I think that in some ways, what he's doing, it is as complex as a Berkeley. It's just, it's everything, right? Instead of, working on a couple of gifts or one big initiative, he has all of the pieces under his purview: annual giving, corporate giving. This is a little bit of a teaser for upcoming episodes, but one of a future guest said that, alumni relations is loving all alumni all the time. And I thought, oh man, that is so true. And I think that's sort of where Karl is, right? He has to love and support everyone. And that's very daunting, but it's possible. And, thinking about bringing in people of all ages and all communities, it's just, I guess you could say he's more of a generalist than someone like Matt or Letty, who is becoming an expert in their one area, but the numbers might be the same.
Yeah. I think we could actually have a whole conversation as well about the pros and cons of working for your alma mater.
Yeah.
And perhaps, again, one of those things that is a healthy environment is a combination of alumni on your team and non-alumni on your team who can bring in some different perspectives. All organizations are different, but oftentimes in higher education, we see several people on the fundraising team who have a degree from the same school. I think that's great. And that brings a whole lot to the table. And it does change the dynamics, though. And you have to work a little harder to separate yourself sometimes.
Yes. And if it's not alma mater, it's, say, a nonprofit where you've had a personal experience or you're a grateful patient. There's just some personal connection that pulls the personal heartstrings. I think that's the important piece, that you have personally experienced what the institution has to offer so that you can speak to it authentically. So maybe that's being a parent, it can come in many forms, but I agree. You have to know the product that you're selling. I mean, I know that sounds really salesy, but it's true. Absolutely.
So let's jump a little bit. I would love to hear about your conversation with Ashutosh Nandashwar, perhaps one of the more technical conversations in that episode. I thought he had some really interesting perspectives on major giving and the role that artificial intelligence may or may not play in the future. What were your takeaways from your conversation with Ashutosh?
Well, I think my biggest takeaway is that AI is here to stay. I think we need to embrace AI as much as we can as fundraisers. And I think that I've always felt this way. Very early in my career, I had a special connection with our research professional on the Trinity team. His name was Stephen Towns. And I loved working with him because he would give me leads and then I would go and actually meet with them and then come back and tell him what happened. And there was this incredible synergy where the loop was closed. And I don't know if I deleted this, but I did ask Ashu if that happens at USC. And he said, almost never. And I think if there was something that I could transform or something that I could say to the people today, it would be form a relationship with your research team, because they really know what they're doing and they're going to give you the good leads if they know that you're going to reach out and get the meeting and tell them how it went. I think that's a major hack that, I mean, I don't mean to say hack as if I'm manipulating, but I'm the only person that I know who does that. So that I was excited for that reason to have him on. I also loved that he is a believer of the David Lively method. David Lively is at Northwestern, and he wrote a book about managing major gift fundraisers. And he believes that all of our portfolios are too big and that we can probably only manage, I can't remember the exact number. It was like 30 to 40. We can only really manage 30 to 40 people at a time. And so there's on any given day, 100 people sitting in our major gift officers portfolios that nothing's happening with. So what Ashu came up with was sort of a way to remind people of that and measure that, but they have to, this goes back to the buy-in. If the fundraisers aren't bought in that this is going to help them and this is important, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe have been, I mean, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but that might have been a little bit of what they had come up against. I mean, he said that he had to shift and change, some of his processes that he had put up, that it was too overwhelming to have like report cards for fundraisers. And I get it to some extent, but I think, I guess it depends on the culture of the institution and it depends on the employees, because some people are not motivated by numbers and they're not motivated by competition, but some people really are. So I think it's knowing who's working for you and how they're motivated and responding accordingly. But I thought he was brilliant and I loved getting to know him.
Yeah. I thought he had some really, he made an interesting point about artificial intelligence, sort of whether or not that really is what we need, because the speed of business in fundraising is not so great that AI could really make a dramatic difference in the true sense of what AI is or can be. But I think what he was sort of getting at is like, there are now tools and technology increasingly that make the jobs easier. And they take away some of those little pieces, kind of like the hacks thing, but like they take away these little things that were cumbersome and therefore not always being done or not being done properly. And ultimately supporting what is still a people-to-people business. It's still, relationships are at the core of the work we do in fundraising. And there's these tools and technology that are making that easier and facilitating that, which is really exciting. I think certainly the things we're seeing, I think, are very exciting.
Yes. And I think part of why this scares people is because it makes them feel like they're replaceable. And that was why I specifically asked Ashu, like, is this meant to replace fundraisers or the frontline work? And the answer is no. You don't need to be intimidated by all of these new tools because they are in existence to enhance. And I want to see what Letty's writing here, that the progress in data science has been a tremendous asset and it helps us focus it helps us focus in the most strategic places. That's Letty Light is saying that in Principal Gifts at Berkeley. So don't be intimidated by the help. I will admit I am someone who I do like to work from my gut. I like to be more in the moment than analytical. That's just my nature. I guess I'm more towards the art than the science. But if I just only go that way, I'm going to be left behind.
Yeah.
So I think also having an awareness of which way you lean and then welcoming the other way. Right. So if you are focused on technology, how can you hone your gut? How can you hone your intuition and your instincts? That would be my advice.
And speaking of being left behind, we are at risk of being left behind here. We're going to be up on time in about 10 minutes. And we've got there's 3 episodes we really haven't touched on. So I want to make sure we get to those. I really loved hearing and listening in to your conversation with Rob Scott at MIT. I love this idea of force multipliers.
Yes.
Some of the things I'll just share that I heard and would love to hear your thoughts on this, but he talked a lot about the opportunity cost of a chief executive devoting time to any given project. So Rob's sort of role, he's essentially created this force multiplier where they have I think it was a faculty member who is out on the road representing the president. Now, one of the things he talked about was there's always something else that CEO could be doing. And so you've got to really plan for your time effectively, because, you know, you talked, Kathryn, in your, the 4 pillars you mentioned, the support of leadership. So I think this is critical. How do you think this concept, though, also may apply with meeting and spending time with prospects, with major donors? You know, they're often busy as well, and something that's giving you their time, there's an opportunity cost for them. Is that something you've run into as a major gift fundraiser?
You know, that point that Rob made was so true, and it actually really did inspire me, because I don't think I fully appreciated, you know, now that I'm at an independent school, I'm working more with the head of school than I ever did with a dean or a big leader at Columbia, just because it's such a big place. And, you know, yes, to a certain extent, development is an important part of their job, but I think it's easy to lose sight of the fact that they don't have to do it. And so to make it as easy as possible, you know, we create briefings. Are they reading them? There's no way for us to know. But are there moments, like Rob talked about, in the hallway when you see this person, to say, hey, don't forget XYZ? Or I loved when he talked about giving feedback live time. I thought that was huge. I've found, for me personally, when I get feedback live time, it's a lot easier to hear, and it feels less personal, and it's less of a big deal. It's just like, hey, you know, you could have been more forthright in that meeting, or, you know, maybe you could have let that other issue go. Maybe that didn't need to be stressed upon. I think it's really important that we build the muscle of giving feedback to our leaders, because while they are the subject expert, and they are probably the most powerful fundraiser in the organization, they're not trained fundraisers. And there's a wide variety of experience that a lot of our leaders have. Some of them are incredibly experienced and maybe don't need feedback, but a lot of them aren't. And so how can we help them feel the most comfortable? And it just sounded like Rob has really mastered that, and that we could learn a lot from him there. I think I answered your question, but I went on a tangent.
And a quick side note, I have to say, I loved Rob's definition of innovation. I'm going to get the words a little bit wrong here, but he said something to the effect of, innovation is the courage to break things. It's an active response to a dissatisfaction with the status quo. It's
you got action. It perfect, James.
Attitude, not a product. It's a way of thinking. I love that. I thought that was a hugely important sort of pull quote from the season. Want to jump quickly to Matt Hutter and his role at Duke, particularly, and you kind of touched on this earlier. Brought in to do a very specific task, very, very specific project, brought in by leadership. What did you learn from that?
Well, I think that these projects, and I say these projects because a lot of big universities have them, these strategic initiatives, as they're called, are so exciting. They're so important. It highlights what makes the institution different. Some of them are, I mean, most of them are incredibly strong in science, but, you know, we have an Earth Institute at Columbia University, and how cool is that? You know, it just it adds personality, I think. But I think a lot of people don't appreciate how hard it is to not have a set constituency base. And Matt was kind of funny about that. I mean, he was honest. It's really hard. You know, you really have to think open-mindedly about who you can bring in and how. That goes back to the collaboration. The other thing I thought was interesting was talking about how these strategic initiatives are, by definition, you know, principal gifts projects, but how can we bring in people at the major gift level in a meaningful way? How can $20,000 have a big impact in these projects? And I think that, I know ultimately it would be great to just have it be principal gifts, but there are people that really care about these issues that are major gifts donors that maybe we could be bringing in. And Matt seemed open to bringing that along. He had talked about a particular fund that was able to bring in smaller gifts. And so I thought that was interesting and exciting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a really fascinating episode to listen to, like the process they've had at Duke and how they've built that program and specific steps they took. So last but not least, we mentioned Jason Briggs at the beginning of this discussion. I want to come back to Jason. Jason's one of my colleagues at BWF. He works with us from England. He talked about looking to other like non-traditional places to learn and get inspiration. And I think he talked about bringing some ideas from the private sector. That's something he's done with Pyro Talks. Also from his own personal experience, his exploration of Tibetan Buddhism. Do you think it's important for our industry and us as professionals to look at other sectors to learn?
The simple answer is yes, absolutely. You know, I had Cece Aparo on, a fellow Trinity alum, maybe a couple months ago. She works at Hoffman and she's a sales trainer. That episode has had an incredible amount of downloads. She speaks from she is a donor and she is a volunteer, but she speaks from a sales perspective. And I learned so much from her. I think all of you did. I think that's why it did so well. And I think we want to constantly be looking outside and taking advice. You know, I also had a real estate agent, a real estate broker, Robert Kadarian, on as well, which you can take a look at if that sounds interesting to you, of just how to build relationships, how other people build relationships, and even to hear what someone else does and think, oh, that wouldn't work for me, or I don't want to do it. It still is informing your skill set and sharpening your tools. I also want to draw from something that my boss said to me. By the way, can you hear the students?
Yes, and I love it. It's
I'm sorry.
a refreshing reminder of where you
I'm
work.
like yelling because I can hear them. We're right next to the gym. But there was something that my boss said to me recently that really struck me. She said, you know, it's great that you love this work and it's great that you have this hobby, this podcast, but make sure that you do other things. Make sure that you enjoy your life and experience New York City and go to concerts and try new things. I think that's true for all of us. Like, we need to be interesting people. We're sitting next to incredibly sophisticated, accomplished people who have wine collections or are passionate about literature or travel the world. And, you know, what she said to me was, you need to be able to hold a conversation or be ready if someone says, what was the most recent book you read? What's your answer? And how are you going to connect with that person? So I also just liked that idea of, like, as fundraisers, we want to be living vibrant lives. Just because it's great to do, but also to foster connection. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, look, if you haven't already subscribed to the Development Debrief podcast, sort that out. You can get that in any podcast app where you normally get your podcast from. Go ahead and subscribe. More conversations with Kathryn happening all the time. When's your next season going to come out?
It should be May. And yeah, I also want to add, you know, please follow the @Dev Debrief account. Share episodes with colleagues and friends that you enjoy. Review the podcast. Any written reviews on Apple, I so appreciate. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I respond to every message. I love hearing from you and just really appreciate the support. I love seeing someone was on from Wisconsin. So thank you so much for listening, and please do engage on social.
And thank you for being here with us today. I want to close by asking the question that you asked all of your guests at the end of each episode. Kathryn, what do you know for sure?
I know for sure that this is important work and that we are part of a special community of people, and I'm so proud to be part of it.
All right. Thank you for being here. Thanks, Kathryn.